It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that passes unnoticed. Steven Seagal walked slowly through a busy public area, dressed simply, blending into the crowd. No entourage. No cameras. Just a quiet moment in the open air. People passed by without a second glance, unaware they were sharing the space with someone known around the world. Then a police officer stepped into his path. "Hey, you, stop right there." The tone wasn't polite. It wasn't professional. It was sharp, dismissive, meant to command. Steven stopped calmly and turned. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer looked him up and down, eyes lingering longer than necessary. "I need to know what you're doing here." "I'm just walking," Steven replied evenly. The officer scoffed. "That's not what I asked. I said, what are you doing here?" Nearby conversations slowed. A few people glanced over. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel threatening. "You got ID?" Steven paused. "May I ask why?" That simple question seemed to irritate him. "Don't make this difficult," the officer snapped. "You're drawing attention to yourself." Steven remained still, hands relaxed at his sides. "I'm not resisting. I'm just asking for clarity." The officer shook his head and laughed quietly, the kind of laugh meant to humiliate. "You people always say that." A couple standing nearby exchanged looks. Something felt off. "Before this goes any further." Backhand index pointing right. Where are you watching this from right now? Comment your country and city below. Because moments like this don't belong to one place. They happen everywhere. The officer's voice grew louder, intentionally so others could hear. "Step over there. Now." Steven noticed phones beginning to rise. He also noticed the officer noticing them, and stiffening. "I haven't done anything wrong," Steven said calmly. "If there's a reason I'm being stopped, I'd like to understand it." The officer's jaw tightened. "You don't get to question me." The air changed. What had been a quiet afternoon was now a public scene. And no one there realized it yet, but the officer was humiliating the wrong man. What happened next would leave everyone standing there in stunned silence. The officer didn't step back. Instead, he squared his shoulders and raised his voice, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "I said move. Right now." Steven remained where he was. "I'm not refusing," he said calmly. "I just want to know why I'm being treated like this." That calmness only seemed to irritate the officer more. "You don't get to decide how this goes," the officer snapped. "I ask questions. You answer them." A few people nearby had stopped pretending not to notice. A man leaned against a light pole, watching closely. A woman across the street slowly lifted her phone, pretending to check a message, but her camera was clearly pointed at the scene. Steven noticed. He also noticed how the officer's eyes flicked toward the phones, then away. "Hands where I can see them," the officer ordered. Steven slowly raised his hands to chest level, deliberately and carefully. "There's no need for this," he said. "I'm cooperating." The officer smirked. "Funny. People always say that right before things go bad." That comment landed heavy. Steven lowered his hands slightly, still visible. "Officer, I've been respectful. I haven't broken any law." The officer stepped closer, invading his personal space. "You're getting real close to testing my patience." Behind them, more phones appeared. No one was hiding it now. "Is everything okay here?" someone from the crowd asked. "Mind your business," the officer snapped without turning around. Steven turned his head slightly toward the crowd. "I'm fine," he said, calm but audible. "I just want this handled properly." The officer laughed again, louder this time. "Handled properly?" He shook his head. "You think you're in charge here?" The atmosphere tightened. Conversations around them stopped entirely. Even the traffic noise seemed distant. Steven took a slow breath. "Authority comes with responsibility," he said. "Not intimidation." That was the moment the officer's expression changed, from irritation to hostility. "You're real comfortable talking back," he said. "You got a problem with police?" "No," Steven replied. "I have a problem with being disrespected for no reason." A teenager openly recording whispered to his friend, "This is crazy." The officer noticed and spun halfway toward them. "Turn that camera off." No one moved. Have you ever seen authority misused right in front of you? Backhand index pointing right, comment yes or no below, and tell us where you're watching from. The officer turned back to Steven, voice low and threatening. "You're embarrassing yourself." Steven met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not the one raising my voice." That silence, that steady refusal to submit or explode, made the crowd uneasy in a new way. This wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a test of character. The officer's hand hovered near his radio. And with that single motion, the tension crossed a line. Because everyone sensed what might happen next. The officer's fingers brushed his radio, lingering there just long enough for everyone watching to notice. That small gesture changed the energy instantly. Steven felt it. The crowd felt it. Even the officer seemed to feel the weight of it. "This is your last warning," the officer said, voice tight. "Provide your ID or I detain you." Steven didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. Instead, he took a slow breath and said, "If you're detaining me, please state the reason." The officer's jaw flexed. "You're being uncooperative." "I've answered every question," Steven replied evenly. "I'm just asking for lawful cause." That word again, lawful. It struck a nerve. "You think you know the law better than me," the officer snapped. "I think the law protects everyone," Steven said. "Including me." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted closer, forming an unintentional circle around them. Phones were no longer hidden. Dozens of lenses were pointed directly at the officer now. Steven's wife stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. Her voice trembled. "Please, this is getting out of hand. Can we just go?" Steven turned to her gently. His expression softened. "I know this is uncomfortable," he said quietly. "But if I walk away right now, this becomes normal." She looked at him, torn between fear and understanding. Behind them, one of the children clutched her sleeve. "Dad, are you in trouble?" Steven knelt slightly, just enough to meet his child's eyes. "No," he said calmly. "I'm standing." That moment, so small, so human, hit the crowd harder than any shout could have. The officer cleared his throat loudly, trying to reclaim control. "Sir, step away from your family." Steven straightened slowly. "They're not the problem," he said. "I'm right here." The officer took a step forward and grabbed Steven's arm. Gasps erupted. A woman covered her mouth. Someone shouted, "Hey!" Steven did not resist. He did not pull away. He simply looked down at the officer's hand, then back up at his face. "Take your hand off me," Steven said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was a boundary. For half a second, the officer hesitated. That hesitation told everyone watching something important. This situation was no longer under his control. Instead of releasing him, the officer tightened his grip slightly. "Don't tell me what to do." The sound of a child crying broke the silence. Steven's jaw tightened, not with anger, but resolve. He looked at the officer again. "You're scaring my family," he said. "That's on you." The crowd began speaking over one another now. "Let him go. He's not doing anything. This is being recorded." The officer finally released Steven's arm, shoving it away as if to save face. "Stay right where you are." Steven didn't move. At this moment, everything could have gone wrong. One wrong reaction. One raised voice. One step forward. Backhand index pointing right. Be honest. What would you do right now? Would you stay calm or react? Comment calm or react below. The officer paced a step away, running a hand over his face. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. The crowd was no longer passive. They were watching critically, silently judging every move. "You think these people care about you?" the officer said, gesturing at the crowd. "They'll be gone in 5 minutes." Steven nodded once. "Maybe," he said. "But this moment will last longer than that." The officer scoffed. You're really enjoying this, huh? No, Steven replied. I wish it wasn't happening. That answer threw the officer off balance. Steven continued, voice steady but firm. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm trying to understand why I was stopped, questioned, and grabbed without cause. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Silence fell. Not the awkward kind, but the heavy kind, where every sound feels too loud. Somewhere in the crowd, a man whispered, "He's not even mad." Another voice responded quietly, "That's what's scary." The officer finally spoke again, louder now, defensive. "You don't fit the usual profile around here." Steven raised an eyebrow slightly. What profile is that? The officer froze. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood it. Steven let the moment sit there, unprotected, for the officer to deal with. "This is exactly why I'm still standing here," Steven said. "Because words like that don't just disappear if no one challenges them." The officer looked around. For the first time, he seemed to realize how many people were watching, and how none of them were on his side. He reached for his radio again. "I'm calling this in." Steven nodded. "That's fine." The officer hesitated. "You're awfully confident." Steven met his eyes. "Confidence comes from knowing who you are," he said. "And knowing you don't need to prove it." The crowd stood completely still. Then, from somewhere behind them, a quiet voice said, "Wait a second." Steven didn't turn. The officer didn't hear it. But the people closest to that voice did. And suddenly, a few heads began to turn, curiosity spreading like a slow ripple. Because someone in that crowd was starting to realize something important. And once that realization surfaced, nothing would be the same. "Wait a second." The voice was quiet, almost uncertain, but it carried just far enough. A man near the back of the crowd leaned closer to his phone, squinting at Steven's face. He tilted his head, then looked again, this time with recognition slowly dawning. "Is that him?" The officer was still busy speaking into his radio, his back half turned, trying to sound in control. "Yeah, I've got a non-compliant individual causing a disturbance," he said. "Requesting assistance." Steven stood calmly, hands visible, posture relaxed. To anyone who knew discipline, it was obvious. This was not a man on the edge. This was a man fully in control of himself. The whisper spread. "That looks like Steven Seagal." "No way. Isn't he a martial artist? I've seen him before. I swear that's him." Phones shifted. Zoomed in. Adjusted angles. A woman a few feet away covered her mouth. "Oh my God. I think that is Steven Seagal." Steven heard the murmurs now. He could feel the energy change, like a current turning direction. He did nothing. He didn't correct them. Didn't confirm. Didn't deny. The officer turned back toward him, frustration written all over his face. "You think calling backup is a joke?" he snapped. Steven shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I think it's your right." That calm answer only made the officer angrier. "You're awfully comfortable for someone in your position." "My position?" Steven asked. The officer waved a hand vaguely. "Standing here wasting my time." The crowd shifted again, closer now. No one was leaving. If anything, more people were stopping to watch. A young man whispered to his friend, "Why isn't he saying who he is?" The friend shook his head. "Because he shouldn't have to." Steven's wife stood just behind him, tense but composed. She could hear the whispers too. She leaned in and spoke softly. "They know who you are." Steven nodded slightly. "That doesn't change what's happening." The officer noticed the exchange. "What are you two whispering about?" "Nothing," Steven said evenly. The officer narrowed his eyes. "You think you're above this?" Steven met his gaze. "No," he said. "I think everyone deserves the same treatment." That answer hit harder than a name ever could have. Behind them, the crowd's whispers grew more confident. "That's definitely him. Why is the cop treating him like that? If this can happen to him..." A woman filming quietly said, "Imagine if this was someone without a voice." That sentence settled heavily over the scene. The officer, still unaware, took another step forward. You're about to talk yourself into a real problem. Steven didn't step back. I'm already in one, he said. I didn't start it. The officer scoffed. You think standing there calmly makes you right? No, Steven replied. It just makes me responsible for how I respond. That word again, responsible. The officer opened his mouth to snap back, then stopped. Something about the way the crowd was watching now, less curious, more judgmental, made him uneasy. He glanced around. Why is everyone staring? No one answered him. They were staring because they were starting to understand. A man near the front finally spoke up, respectful but clear. Officer, you might want to reconsider how you're handling this. The officer spun on him. Stay out of it. Steven lifted a hand slightly, not to silence the officer, but to calm the crowd. It was a subtle gesture, almost unnoticeable. But it worked. The murmurs softened. The officer turned back to Steven, voice tense. You enjoying the attention? Steven shook his head. I'm concerned by it. That honesty threw the officer off again. You could end this, the officer said. Just tell me who you are. Steven paused for the first time. The crowd leaned in, breath held. Then he said, Who I am isn't the issue. The officer stared at him. Then what is? Steven looked around, at the phones, the families, the faces reflecting fear, anger, recognition. The issue, he said slowly, is that the outcome of this interaction shouldn't depend on whether you recognize my face. Silence. Real silence. The kind that forces reflection. The officer shifted uncomfortably. He suddenly felt exposed, not because he knew who Steven was, but because everyone else might. A police siren sounded faintly in the distance. Backup was on the way. The crowd buzzed quietly now, anticipation replacing tension. Someone whispered, He's handling this like a master. Another replied, That's because he is. Steven remained still, grounded, waiting. He had every opportunity to end this with a single sentence. He chose not to. Because what mattered wasn't who he was. It was what this moment represented. And as the sound of the approaching cruiser grew louder, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The officer was about to learn the truth. And it wasn't going to come from Steven himself. The sound of the approaching cruiser grew louder, then faded as it slowed somewhere nearby. The officer straightened his posture, as if the presence of backup would restore the authority he felt slipping away. He adjusted his belt, cleared his throat, and turned back to Steven with a forced confidence that no longer convinced anyone. All right, he said sharply. Let's reset this. Steven studied him for a moment, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something closer to disappointment. A reset doesn't erase what already happened, Steven said. The officer scoffed. You're still talking. Yes, Steven replied calmly. Because this still matters. The crowd had gone quiet again. Not tense this time, focused. Every phone was steady now. No one wanted to miss what came next. The officer crossed his arms. You've made your point. People are watching. Congratulations. Steven shook his head slightly. That's not my point. Oh, the officer said. Then what is? Steven took a slow step forward, not into the officer's space, but into the moment. His voice remained level, yet something in it changed. It wasn't louder. It was clearer. My point, he said, is that respect shouldn't depend on how someone looks, where they're from, or whether you recognize them. A ripple moved through the crowd. The officer laughed uneasily. You're turning this into a speech. No, Steven said. I'm turning it into a mirror. That landed harder than anything else he could have said. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Steven continued, his words deliberate. You questioned me without cause. You raised your voice. You grabbed my arm in front of my family. The officer snapped. You were being difficult. Steven nodded. I was being calm. The difference hung in the air. I didn't insult you, Steven went on. I didn't threaten you. I didn't resist you. Yet you treated me like a problem that needed to be controlled. The officer shifted his weight, uncomfortable now. You don't know what we deal with out here. Steven met his eyes. And you don't know what it's like to be treated as suspicious for simply existing. That sentence drew a collective inhale from the crowd. A woman near the front whispered, "He's saying everything everyone's thinking." Steven glanced briefly at the faces around him, young and old, different backgrounds, united by attention. Then he looked back at the officer. "This job gives you power," Steven said. "But power without self-control isn't strength. It's liability." The officer's jaw tightened. "You think you're teaching me my job?" "No," Steven replied. "I think today is teaching all of us something." Backhand index pointing right. If you believe respect is stronger than force, tap like right now. Because what Steven says next changes everything. The officer exhaled sharply, frustration spilling over. "You think this crowd decides what's right?" Steven answered without hesitation. "No. Character does." Silence followed. The officer glanced at the crowd again, noticing how no one was laughing now. No one was siding with him. Even those who had arrived late sensed who held the moral ground. "You could have ended this any time," the officer said. "You could have just said who you are." Steven nodded. "I know. Then why didn't you?" Steven paused. "Not for drama, but because the answer mattered. Because if fairness only applies to people you recognize," he said, "then it isn't fairness." The officer swallowed. Steven's voice softened slightly, but the authority remained. "If you had treated me with respect from the start, my name would be irrelevant. And if you hadn't, my name still shouldn't save me." A man in the crowd murmured, "That's real." The officer rubbed his forehead, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. "You're making me out to be the villain." Steven shook his head. "I'm giving you a chance not to be." That line changed everything. The officer looked at Steven, not as a subject, not as a threat, but as an equal. And for the first time since the encounter began, his voice dropped. "I was doing my job," he said quietly. Steven nodded. "Then do it with dignity." The second cruiser finally pulled into view at the edge of the crowd. Its lights flashed once, briefly illuminating the faces watching. The door opened, and another officer stepped out. The original officer straightened instinctively, relief and fear mixing on his face. Steven didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The crowd buzzed again, not with anger now, but anticipation. The officer cleared his throat. "Backup's here. This is about to get official." Steven nodded once. "Good. Why?" the officer asked. "Why are you so calm?" Steven finally allowed himself the smallest smile, not smug, not proud. Just certain. "Because calm is what keeps situations from becoming tragedies," he said. The second officer approached, scanning the scene, the crowd, the phones, the tension that still lingered. "Everything okay here?" the newcomer asked. Before the first officer could answer, Steven spoke. "That depends," he said calmly, "on how we choose to move forward." The crowd leaned in. Because everyone could feel it now. The balance of power had shifted. And the next words spoken weren't going to humiliate Steven Seagal. They were going to reveal the truth. The second officer stepped closer, his eyes moving carefully across the scene. He noticed the crowd first. The phones. The unusual stillness. Then his gaze landed on Steven. Something changed. Not dramatically, not at first. Just a slight pause. A longer look than necessary. His brow furrowed as if a memory had been triggered but hadn't fully surfaced yet. "Sir," the second officer said cautiously, "can I ask your name?" Steven answered calmly. "Steven." The first officer let out a short laugh, trying to regain control. "See. Nothing special." But the second officer didn't look convinced. He took another step closer, studying Steven's face more carefully now. The posture. The stillness. The unmistakable presence of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering restraint. His eyes widened, just slightly. "Steven Seagal?" he asked. The world seemed to stop. For half a second, no one spoke. Not the crowd. Not the officers. Not even the phones made a sound. The first officer turned sharply. What? The second officer didn't take his eyes off Steven. Sir, are you Steven Seagal? Steven didn't smile. Didn't correct him immediately. Didn't look around to gauge reactions. Yes, he said simply. The reaction was instant. A wave of gasps rolled through the crowd, followed by whispers that quickly turned into open voices. That's him. I knew it. Oh my God. He stayed calm the whole time. The first officer's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Steven again, as if seeing him for the first time. The confidence. The calm. The way the entire crowd seemed to shift around him. I didn't know, the officer stammered. If I had known. Steven raised a hand gently. That's exactly why this matters, he said. The second officer straightened his posture immediately. Sir, I apologize for the situation, he said respectfully. Can you tell me what happened? Before Steven could respond, voices from the crowd spoke up. He was calm the whole time. The officer grabbed him. There was no reason for the stop. The second officer listened carefully, nodding slowly. The first officer stood frozen, suddenly aware of how different his tone sounded now compared to earlier. I was just doing my job, he said weakly. Steven looked at him, not with anger, but with clarity. Your job, Steven said, should look the same no matter who you're speaking to. The crowd murmured in agreement. The second officer turned to his colleague. Did you have probable cause for the stop? The question landed like a weight. The first officer hesitated. He looked suspicious. The crowd reacted immediately. That's not a reason. Unbelievable. Say it louder. Steven didn't react outwardly, but his eyes hardened just slightly. Suspicious how? He asked calmly. The officer swallowed. He didn't fit the usual profile. The second officer exhaled slowly. That's not lawful cause, he said firmly. Silence. The first officer's shoulders slumped. Steven took a step forward, not to assert dominance, but to ground the moment. This isn't about embarrassing anyone, he said. It's about understanding how easily power can be misused when assumptions replace judgment. The second officer nodded. Sir, would you like to file a formal complaint? The crowd held its breath. Steven paused. He looked at his family, then at the people recording, then back at the officers. I want accountability, he said. Not revenge. That answer surprised everyone. The first officer looked up, hope flickering briefly in his eyes. But accountability means this doesn't get ignored, Steven added. Not for me, and not for the next person. The second officer nodded again. Understood. He turned to his colleague. We'll be documenting this interaction. The first officer said nothing. The crowd began to clap, not loudly, not aggressively, but with purpose. Steven didn't acknowledge it. He focused instead on his children, kneeling briefly to reassure them. It's okay, he said softly. We're safe. The second officer addressed the crowd. Thank you for remaining calm. This situation is being handled. But the crowd already knew. They had just witnessed something rare. Not a shouting match. Not violence. Not ego. But dignity under pressure. The first officer finally spoke again, voice low. I misjudged you. Steven looked at him. You misjudged a situation, he said. Learn from it. That was it. No lecture. No threat. No victory lap. The second officer stepped back, speaking into his radio. We'll need to follow up internally. As the tension dissolved, people began lowering their phones, though many kept recording, knowing this moment would matter later. Steven stood, calm as ever. But the story wasn't over. Because within minutes, those videos would begin circulating. And the world would soon see what happened when authority met restraint. And lost. By the time Steven and his family walked away, the crowd was still standing in place, quiet, reflective, changed. No one tried to stop him. No one asked for photos. They watched with respect. Within hours, the videos began to spread. At first, they appeared as short clips, shaky phone footage, raw audio, captions filled with disbelief. Then longer versions surfaced. Angles from every direction. Each one showing the same thing, a man staying calm while authority lost its balance. By nightfall, the story was everywhere. Comments flooded in by the millions. He never raised his voice. That's real strength. If this can happen to him, imagine everyone else. People didn't argue about who Steven Seagal was. They talked about what he represented in that moment. Morning news programs replayed the footage, pausing on key moments. Experts debated procedure. Former officers weighed in. Civil rights advocates pointed to the exchange as a textbook example of how profiling begins, and how restraint can stop escalation. The department released a brief statement, promising an internal review. The officer was placed on leave. But the most powerful response didn't come from officials. It came from ordinary people. Parents talked to their children about dignity. Teachers used the video in classrooms. Strangers shared it with captions like, "This is how you stand without fighting." Steven didn't go on a press tour. He didn't release a statement. When he finally spoke, it was through a simple message posted online. Respect should never be earned by recognition. It should be given by default. The post went viral instantly. People from every country commented beneath it, sharing their own experiences. Times they stayed silent, times they spoke up, times they wished they had done one or the other. Steven's message was shared alongside one short clip, the moment he said, "Fairness that depends on fame isn't fairness at all." That line became a quote. Then a caption. Then a reminder. As for the officer, the review continued. Training was reassessed. Procedures questioned. Conversations started inside the department that had been avoided for years. Steven never followed up publicly. He didn't need to. The impact was already visible. Weeks later, someone asked him in an interview how he managed to stay so calm. He paused, then answered simply, "Because anger gives power away. Calm keeps it." That answer spread just as fast. This wasn't a story about celebrity. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about showing that dignity doesn't require permission, and that sometimes the strongest response is restraint. If you believe no one should ever be judged by appearance, type honor in the comments and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Because stories like this don't end when the camera stops rolling. They continue every time someone chooses respect over reaction.